computer. Okay, I think it's recording. So hi, my name is Vivekanand, and I'll give like a quick introduction to myself for anyone who's watching who doesn't know who I am. So I am a postdoc. I'm actually a Translational Research Institute for Space Health postdoc um, in the Ashton Graybill Spatial Orientation Lab at Brandeis University. And just as a quick, like 1 or 2 sentences, I study spatial disorientation. And that's basically when people lose sense of where they are relative to gravitational vertical. And to do that, I strap people into this huge machine to study that. And along this journey, because my funding agency is associated with NASA, and so like my research questions are trying to answer the roadmap risks and gaps that NASA puts out there. One of the things I've been thinking about are technological countermeasures that can help in spatial disorientation that astronauts will experience when, for example, they're in zero-G and they're trying to land upon the surface of Mars or the Moon. So as I was thinking about technological countermeasures, what that sort of refers to is the idea of human augmentation, of adding sensors, sort of enhancing the human so that they can sort of pilot the spacecraft better where perhaps they may not be able to pilot well. And so while looking at this idea of enhancing humans through technology, I formed a small group which consists of undergrads and high school students. It's actually open to everyone, so if anyone wants to join, I'll put a description in the link. And so what we do, we're just in the very early stages. We use these microprocessors called Arduinos and little sensors, and we're just learning how to wire everything together. In the process, I met and talked to Tasha, and I invited her to talk to this group about how maybe human augmentation and sort of what these students are doing could help on Tasha's journey. And so, yeah, Tasha, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit and talk about your journey?
Sure. So I'm Tasha Chemmel. I'm 34 years old. I live in the Boston area. I've been totally blind since birth. I have some light perception, but I'm usually not consciously aware of light. And my condition is due to a retinal disease called Leber's congenital amaurosis. So I have some photoreceptor cells in my retinas, but a lot of them are not working correctly or they have degenerated. And the other consequence of Leber's congenital amaurosis is nystagmus. And nystagmus basically refers to involuntary eye movements. So I don't really have control of where my eyes are in space, or I don't know where it is they're pointing in space. When I was about 23 years old, I discovered that when I use medical marijuana, I can actually start to sense some light and some color. And then eventually I taught myself to be able to sense some shapes and even to recognize some objects by sight, which is pretty cool considering that the scientific literature basically says that if you've been blind since birth like me, you wouldn't have a reference point to be able to recognize objects visually. And for some reason, I was able to. And it's probably to do with synesthesia, which is multiple senses merging together. When I'm using the marijuana and I'm having these visual experiences, what happens is I start to map the space around my eyes to visual space that's outside of my body. And I experience all of these really interesting sensations of my eyes tugging against my hands and my hips and different parts of my body. And for example, like if I'm walking down the street and there's a really tall building, I might feel my eyes start to tug upward. And I've learned to recognize that as being a sign that, oh, like maybe there's a tall building in my vicinity. And this has been a really cool journey and seeing what marijuana was able to teach me. But ultimately, I've concluded that it's not the end point of my journey. Marijuana has a lot of side effects. I've been having migraines. It kind of makes your mental state not so optimal. It's not something that I can use on a daily basis. So I've been really interested in talking with people like Vivek and other researchers to try to figure out another solution or another way of having these experiences or having an emotional and physical reaction to the visual world.
And just to like understand, you know, like your condition a little bit better.
Sure.
So you said you have like a few photoreceptors,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
but then typically like you're not consciously aware of like what's happening around you or anything like that.
No. So visually, if someone were to come into a room and they'd turn on the light, I probably wouldn't be able to tell you that that happened. If I was in an auditorium and the lights came on and there was a very extreme change from dark to light, I might be able to sense it. But on a daily basis, I'm not aware of the light around me, and I'm not aware of where my eyes are pointing in space. Like I've talked to people before and they said, wow, you're looking at me. And unless I'm using the marijuana, I don't have that awareness of me looking at them or where my eyes are.
And then when you use like the marijuana, like
Yeah.
is it sort of like you have the like you feel like you actually see something, or is it just like a thought emerges and you're not seeing it, but just like it's something's bubbling up?
I've had both. So I've had that sort of thought where maybe I'm having like a physical sensation of sitting in front of a table where there's a remote control on it. And I might have this physical sensation of my eyes moving far away from my body on this horizontal plane. And then I might think like there's a table there and there might be a remote on the table. But then I've also had experiences that are much less thought-based and much more sensation-based. Like there was one time when I walked into a Whole Foods and there was a case of ice cream. And before that moment, I didn't realize that ice creams are stacked on top of each other. I had this idea that they were just on a shelf in like a single layer. I had no idea that there were basically these castles of ice cream in Whole Foods. And when I was having this visual experience with marijuana, it wasn't thought-based. It was definitely this very, very vivid sensation of learning something new about my surroundings through a sense that I didn't know that I could experience.
That's like, you know, and then like in terms of like what is it that like like would be like the most ideal sort of thing, you know, like that you could acquire, you know? Yeah.
So what I'm really hoping to be able to do is, as I was saying, to have this emotional response to the visual objects in my environment. There's all kinds of apps out there that people are designing. They're really cool. They use computer vision where I could pick up my smartphone and it could tell me that something is in my surroundings. It could tell me, it could read a sign to me. It could tell me there's a picture of a dog. Those are great and I use them and they definitely have a purpose. But what I'm hoping for is something different. I'm wired in kind of an interesting way. I've talked to other blind people and of course I don't, you know, I can't represent all blind people and can't speak to their experiences. But from my understanding, I crave this visual experience because my brain is kind of wired in a way where my other senses are almost expecting vision that it's not receiving. So for example, if you ask me to think of a route from point A to point B, I'll try to almost imagine a line of sight. And that's not even really that functional for me. As anyone knows me can attest to, I get lost a lot and wander around in circles. So imagining a line of sight that I don't have is not that useful, but it's almost like my brain is expecting that. I do want to make the important point though, that just because that's how my particular brain is wired does not mean that I think that all blind people need the technology that I'm going to talk about or would want it or it would benefit them. I'm really just talking about my own unique experience because I think it's really easy for people to have this idea of sight is better by default. And that's the last thing that I want to say, because, you know, sight is just one of our senses. It's just one tool in our toolbox. I think I'm fascinated by it in part because I don't get to experience it on a regular basis. But if, you know, if I did get to experience sight, it would just help all of my other senses come online more and work together more. It wouldn't be making me a different person than who I already was, or it wouldn't be fixing something that was broken. I would just be allowing me to be who I already am.
Yeah, so like, I wonder what your thoughts are on this whole, field of sensory substitution. I'll do like a quick, overview, but the basic idea with sensory substitution is that, like, let's say one sensory system, may not be working, let's just say the visual system, then you can substitute that information through a different sensory system. And the idea is that, like, the machinery in your brain is ready to process the information. And if that information isn't coming through your eyes, then you can also give it through, your ears or your skin or your tongue. And, so one of these examples, what they do is they have this like 12 by 12 array of little shockers that people put on their tongue, which I know you're aware of because we talked about it beforehand. And that little shocker thing is connected to a camera. And so then whatever the camera sees, it like simplifies it. And then that image, like let's say there's a big X, then that X is represented by like an X-shaped shock on your tongue. And what the claim is, and again, like I haven't done like the full literature search, but from what I've done, I haven't found like a lot of compelling evidence for this particular. So there is evidence that says that, okay, people can use it, they can avoid obstacles, they can sort of, with like 10 hours of training or 20 hours of training, they can start to like recognize some objects. So there's evidence for that. But then the next claim is that people forget that they actually have shocks in their tongue, and they are almost basically merged with this device and are experiencing, not necessarily sight, but some equivalent to it. So I don't know, what are your thoughts about it? If we could take the information out there that you were getting from the tugs and, from your eyes and stuff like that, and just represent it as like vibrations on your body or shocks in your tongue, is that appealing for you, not appealing? What are your thoughts on that?
I think sensory substitution is really cool and has a lot of great benefits and applications and can help a lot of people. I think what I'm looking for is a little bit different, and that's in part because I already have this relationship with my eyes. I've already gotten to have these really wild experiences of perceiving things with my eyes and with my whole body in this really interesting synesthetic way. And having something translated into vibrations would feel to me like speaking in a second or third language. And if you've tried to learn another language, I'm sure you can relate to this experience of, at first, at least it's pretty laborious. Like you're trying to remember the grammar, you're trying to string words together, and you're maybe a little bit more emotionally distanced from what it is you're trying to say or what other people are trying to say. And that's kind of how I think about sensory substitution, is it's speaking in that other language. And so I might be having access to the information if something's being translated into vibration or pulses on my tongue or that sort of thing, but I'm not having that visceral reaction to something that I've already experienced. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I'm looking to do something that's a little bit different to sensory substitution. It's related, but it's a little bit different.
No, it's really interesting, and I think it's a really fascinating insight too. Like as we think about just like the general field of human augmentation, each astronaut is, from the point of view of my research, would have like a different sort of like sensory motor profile. They'll have different preferences, and personalizing this experience of like merging with technology or whatever, so that you feel more attuned with whatever's happening around you, may be as important, if not more, than the actual information that's being transmitted. And so what you're saying is that for you and for your journey, um, what's important is that the language that these technology or devices or whatever it is speaking is something that's like intrinsic to like what's your identity,
Mm-hmm.
and I think this is a really, and I'm not sure if I'm doing a good job articulating it, but like the really deep important point here for anyone thinking about human augmentation or sensory substitution is really like, yeah, what is the language that these devices are using to communicate to the person? How do you personalize that, and how do you customize that to each person? That's a, I appreciate that sort of insight into it. Um, so like I guess like before we go into like sort of like what your technological dream would be, like what is a device that you're sort of interested in, we can take a slight detour into sort of like how you and I met, which was because I was running an experiment, and I'll give like a quick like 1 minute explanation of what I do, and then maybe you can kind of share what your hypotheses were, because
Mm-hmm.
you approached my experiment with like a your own experiment, and that, which is really cool because like few people do that. I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about you, is that you're like a intuitive experimenter, or like an experimenter at heart, because you're always like trying to find, explore, and understand. So basically what I do is I take people, I strap them into a machine, I blindfold them, and they also wear noise canceling headsets. And in my first condition, they're in the upright, and the machine is just sort of, you could say, programmed to just fall to one side or the other, just like trying to balance a pencil, or your body or whatever. And maybe in the link I'll put like a better description, of a talk that I gave that has my PowerPoint, so you can sort of see exactly what I'm talking about. But for now, you know, people are in this machine, it's sort of like falling over, and they use a joystick to just keep themselves balanced. And the first few questions are just like, okay, if you don't have vision, if you don't have your legs that have all these reflexes and things like that, you can't use any of that. How do you balance, and what does balance look like in that situation? And in that condition, because you're in the upright and you're tilting relative to gravity, you have this thing in your inner ear called the vestibular system. And your vestibular system in this condition can detect, how much you're tilting from gravity. It gives you a good sense of where you are. So people learn to do this task pretty well. The second condition, which I call my space flight condition, I take people and I tilt them so that they're on their back. And when they're on their back, they're no longer tilting relative to gravity. So they can't use gravity to figure out like where they are. Okay, so on their back, people get very disoriented, just like an astronaut may. And they lose sense of where they are. They do this interesting thing of positional drifting where they get further and further away from the balance point. They have no idea that they're so far away. Then they hit the crash boundary, and then the machine resets. Now again, for people listening to this for the first time, none of this is really going to make 100% sense. So definitely watch my presentation with the PowerPoint. Then it'll make sense. So that's the setup. I have one condition where people can't use gravity to do the task. They get very confused about where they are. I was just curious to run you and just see what your experience was. But you had like a second deeper thing that you were exploring. So can you sort of describe that a little bit?
Yeah. So my experience of having nystagmus, which is those uncontrollable eye movements where my eyes kind of jerk around or wander, is kind of similar to what I felt when I was lying in the machine in that condition where I wasn't able to use gravitational cues. I have like a vague idea where straight ahead or up is when I'm trying to move my eyes around, but not really. I can kind of tell when I'm looking to the left. I can kind of tell when I'm looking to the right. It takes a lot of effort. And so when I was lying in this machine trying to balance myself, I saw a parallel. Like it felt like it was almost a metaphor for my experience of not knowing where these crash boundaries were and not knowing where left and right was. And
It's interesting because like when I'm just to like explain like how disorienting this condition is, when I'm inside the machine on the back, like I lose sense of where I am so fast. Like I have no idea where the balance point is. I hit these crash boundaries, and I get all sorts of weird illusions and stuff like that. And you're saying that this is like a way that I can sort of experience what you feel like just with your eyes, because you don't know where they are, and they sort of hit the crash boundaries, and then you kind of know, oh, okay, I'm at the absolute edge, and then maybe, they reorient or something like that. Yeah.
Right. So the other thing that happened when I was in this machine, right, is Vivek was talking about these sorts of hallucinations. I had some of that after I was done with the machine. Like even when I was wearing my blindfold, I started to have this sensation of someone's hand when people were walking around the room, and like light all around me. And this was kind of supporting this hypothesis that I had, that when I was on marijuana, the feedback from my vestibular system, I was more sensitive to it. And I was, we talk about it, like weighting that more significantly. I was paying more attention to it. And so being in the machine kind of replicated that for me. And the types of oscillations that I was experiencing, which were these very sudden, rapid oscillations, seemed like they were triggering something called the vestibulo-ocular reflex, which basically means that if you're looking all the way in one direction, your eyes move to the other direction.
Just to add on to that, so the vestibular ocular reflex is one of the reflexes that's been studied a lot. I actually, even though it's close to the work that I do, I haven't actually read extensively on it. But like as a quick description, for example, if I take my thumb and put it in front of my, face, and I fixate my eyes there, and I start moving my head back and forth, my eyes will stabilize, which is pretty crazy if you think about it, because like I can do some really complicated stuff, like moving my head in diagonal and all sorts of stuff, and yet my eyes will always correct themselves. And this is because they're taking the velocity information that your vestibular system is detecting, and they're commanding your eyes based on how your head moves to move in the opposite direction. And it's just absolutely a remarkable reflex that we all rely upon on a daily basis. And so the idea, I think what Tasha is saying, is that in very rapid, high velocity movements, it can often trigger your eyes to move, very rapidly. And so, Tasha, what you're saying is that you feel like there's some connection between activating the vestibular system that then triggers the VOR reflex, and some of the sensations that you experience that you want to experience more.
Yeah, exactly. Because what happens when I'm having this vestibular ocular reflex multiple times is that suddenly I start to get a sense of where the crash boundaries are, right? I start to get a sense of where all the way left is, or all the way right is, or all the way up is, or all the way down is. I start to figure out, like, okay, these are the boundaries.
And actually, so, really sorry to interrupt. It just reminded me of something, and I forget if I told you this or not. So I ran this experiment with people on the back, and did this machine learning thing to cluster them into like people who are very proficient and people who are not proficient. And when I looked at the people who are not proficient, what was really interesting is that they were all doing the same strategy, which was that they took the joystick and they smashed it as hard as they could back and forth. And so the machine went crazy. It was just going as fast as it possibly could. But what was really fascinating was that even though they were doing this like really insane strategy, they were actually hitting the crash boundaries less, because they had a pretty good sense of where they were, just because the machine was going so fast. The ambiguity was sort of taken out of it. And that's kind of similar to, in a way, what you're saying.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was just about to say, actually, because when when you're looking all the way in one direction, like any person, like if you're looking all the way to the left or all the way to the right, you feel a sort of stretching sensation in your eye muscles that is similar to like when you take your arm and you stretch it all the way to the left. And that is your proprioception, which is a sense that we all have that helps us orient to where our limbs are in space. So our eyes actually have those stretch receptors in them. Like we don't, I'm sure as a sighted person, you're not really like spending a lot of time thinking about the stretch receptors in your eyes, but they exist. And for me, what's really cool is having this repeated VOR triggers those stretch receptors, because if I'm looking all the way in one direction, I'm getting the most stretch possible, which means that I'm more likely to be aware of that stretch sensation. And then I'm able to learn from that because it's an unambiguous signal. Like if I'm stretched all the way to the left, it's going to feel different from when I'm stretched all the way to the right. And then the other thing that happens is, the other predictability that's built into that is, if you're looking all the way to the left, right, you're going to reset. Like your eyes can't stay there for that long. And like you're eventually you're going to reset and you're going to experience this contraction. And I experience those. That's one of the experiences that I have when I'm using the marijuana, is this stretch all the way in one direction, and then a contraction, and then a stretch, and then a contraction.
So like, I guess my question, which I'm not sure I still fully understand. So I mean, why is it that feeling the stretch in your eyes is so meaningful for you? Like what does that give you?
Well, because usually if I don't know which direction my eyes are pointing, right? Like if I don't have an awareness of which direction they're pointing in, having the stretch gives me that awareness. So I can tell, like I'm looking left, and now I'm looking right, and now I'm looking more left, and now I'm looking down, and now I'm looking up. And I feel the stretch not only in my eyes, but like in other parts of my body as well. So maybe my shoulders or my torso. And if I know where my eyes are pointing, I can start to do this thing where I'm mapping the space around my eyes to space that's further away from my body. And when I'm doing that, I'm taking in the light that I'm seeing, or the images that the light that I am able to perceive, and I'm having the ability to make meaningful predictions about what it is that I could be seeing.
So let me see if I can summarize to see if I understand. So what you're basically saying is that when you feel a stretch in your eyes, you get a sense of which way your eyes are pointing. And based on which way your eyes are pointing, you can then collect, let's say, the photons or whatever it is. And in the instances where you do see something, you can then be like, okay, this is what it is. But if you don't know where your eyes are, then whatever you're collecting, you don't know where to put it. And as a result, that might get jumbled up, and you won't get that information, which otherwise you may get if you know where your eyes are.
And I think I probably just tune it out, honestly, because it's meaningless information, right? It's information that's noisy. It's like, it's so ambiguous. Like if I don't know where it's coming from, I can't make any sort of predictions about what it could be.
So I mean, so a few thoughts. I mean, the first thing is, Alberto. So in when you did the presentation for the talk, Alberto, who's a really awesome research engineer in the lab. I mean, his one idea was that like maybe the marijuana is actually helping stabilize your eyes and prevent the stretching from happening. And as a result, as long as your eyes are stable, you're collecting more photons per unit time, and so you get an image. I mean, do you think that knowing exactly where your eyes are super important, or just having your eyes stable, or maybe like a mixture of both probably?
I think so. I'm a rock climber, and so I've actually made a lot of connections between these stretching sensations and rock climbing. Because if you're rock climbing and you're trying to reach all the way to the right, like to find a hold, you can basically be having 3 of your limbs locked, right? And then have one of them free to move around, and then kind of stretch out to reach that that hold. So I actually see the stretching as something that helps me be able to achieve this stability. So it's as if I was in that machine. I was in Vivek's machine, and I was getting all sorts of cues about where left was, or where right was, or where up was, and that I'm using that to stabilize.
So then there maybe, one idea is like, let's say, you've done eye tracking before, where you put this device and it can sort of track which way your eyes are going. And, what if then, and I think I know your answer, but what if like, okay, we take that and we convert it to vibration in the body. So you feel like, okay, you know exactly where your eyes are. They're not through stretch, but it is through like, okay, through the vibrations. But I think your response is that it's not going to be the right language, and therefore
It's,
it's not.
yeah, exactly. It's not going to be the right language because for me, I think that the right language for me is gravity. I
Mm,
think that's why I've resonated so much with Vivek's work, is that gravity is the language that I want to speak, or that my body wants to speak. Because I've had so many experiences of, for example, if I'm looking at a shiny reflective surface, I feel like I'm walking on that surface and slipping on it. So that's been a commonality for all of these visual experiences that I've had, is that they've had some impact on my perception of my sense of gravity,
mm.
and not only where my eyes are in space, but where my whole body is in space. And so something like a vibration wouldn't necessarily be in that language that I want to speak.
So then, you had proposed a different option. So I
Yeah.
said, when I asked you, yeah, so what is your dream technology? Maybe dream is the wrong word, but what is a technology that you've been thinking about recently?
So the technology that I'm thinking of using is some kind of wearable that uses galvanic vestibular stimulation, which is basically stimulating the nerves in the inner ear with electrical impulses. And that would, what that would be doing is, because I don't want to be walking around all the time, moving my head around and jerking it from side to side, and also because that would be motion I would be producing myself, and I would probably just tune that out, because that's what happens with self-generated motion. I want to feel as if I'm experiencing those rapid oscillations that I experienced in Vivek's machine without jerking my head around all the time. So I want to simulate that sensation. And that's what my device would do. So galvanic vestibular stimulation, like what I know about it is it's pretty extreme. Like people can use it to make someone walk across a room, almost remote control them. And I don't want that, right?
Sure. So,
But
so that's so just so I can add on. So yeah, so
yeah.
these would be like, little electric currents that are, taking a path that people don't exactly know what
Mm-hmm.
the path is. And your vestibular system is composed of the semicircular canals and the otoliths. The
Mm-hmm.
canals are what detect angular acceleration and velocity, and are primarily responsible for the VOR reflex.
Mm-hmm.
And then your otoliths detect linear acceleration, like tilt and gravity, stuff like that. And they may have some effect on the VOR. I have to do more reading, but um, ultimately the galvanic stimulation is sort of like a blunt hammer that's hitting like everything and not exactly sure how it's hitting. So some of the side effects, which I think you're aware of, um, it could induce some amount of motion sickness, because it's telling you your vestibular system is then being activated, saying that you're rotating or moving, but then all of your proprioception is telling you no, in fact you're not. So then that side effect may be equivalent to the headaches and stuff like that you're experiencing with marijuana. Um, so yeah, so what are your thoughts on that?
So my thoughts are, and this is where the dreaming piece comes in, and this is where I would need the help of collaborators or people who are familiar with this technology, is I would need a way to control it, right? I would need a way to produce something that was much lighter stimulation. So it actually would probably have to be something that was just at the threshold of conscious awareness, right? That was just a very, very, very small dose of stimulation, but that would be enough for my body to be like, wait, what is this thing? Because if it was so subtle, I wouldn't be able to pick up on it. So it would have to hit that sweet spot of, wow, I'm sitting here and it feels as if I'm moving my head or my neck slightly, or my head and neck are being moved slightly. And that could be triggering that VOR and then those stretching sensations. And then I could start to play with that and to make predictions about what I'm seeing, informed by the context of what's around me, because that's important too, is I need some contextual information. This isn't like a magical thing that suddenly makes me be able to recognize anything. It is contextually
I don't know.
driven.
Have you heard about like stochastic resonance and that whole idea?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And that resonates a lot with the way that I've been thinking
For
about
anyone
this.
that doesn't know, it's a really fascinating field. And the idea behind stochastic resonance is that you give almost like really subthresholds. This is below even detection. And you basically put noise into the system. And the early experiments where they were doing this was with like touch. So like, for example, if you put like random vibrations onto your finger, and then your fingertip is touching, you know, some small bumps, without the vibrations, you may not be able to distinguish the bumps. But with the vibrations now, you can actually detect it better. And people have done that for like, you know, on the soles of their feet to like enhance balancing. And the idea is that by dumping in a whole bunch of noise, the mechanoreceptors get closer to threshold of firing the action potential. So they get more sensitive and they fire easier. And so, you know, the idea is that you can detect things better as a result of it. And I think there are some people that are looking at like stochastic resonance with galvanic stimulation. But I think as you mentioned, like you know, like what you want to do is like you want to control the VOR very well, you know, at a subthreshold level enough so you can feel some tugs on your eyes um, that coordinate maybe with the scene in front of you, so that your eyes are maybe like fixated in one area. Is that a good summary of like
Yeah.
what? Okay.
Yeah, totally. And it, you know, it could be too that my eyes are already fixating on things around me and I'm just not aware of it. So whatever this system, it could just be complementing some of what I'm already doing, and it's creating this feedback loop where I'm getting better information because my eyes know where they're going, and my eyes know where they're going so that I can get better information. So there's a loop happening there.
Yeah. So I think those were all of
Yeah.
my you know, questions based on
Mm-hmm.
our previous discussion. And I think like having these discussions and having them often is really good. I think, you know, as concluding points, like neither of us are experts specifically on these things. These are just like exploratory talks where we're, you know, investigating different ideas, and then maybe we'll go into literature and read it some more, like more details on galvanic stimulation stuff, because I actually haven't read too much literature on that. But I think it's just so valuable to meet like really cool people like you and have these discussions and think and dream a little bit. And you know, hopefully like my group and I can, once we learn like the basics, maybe not necessarily through galvanic stimulation, because shocking a person sounds pretty intense, but like some other method, we may be able to do something cool. Um, yeah, any last parting thoughts for anyone watching?
Sure, yeah. And just to kind of reiterate what Vivek said, I'm not attached to galvanic vestibular stimulation. I think I am attached to these interesting tugging sensations that I've experienced. But I really am a public amateur. Like, this is me exploring. I want to be open. I want to explore other avenues. So if you have other thoughts, something that I haven't considered, that doesn't involve shocking the inner ear, I'm really open to hearing about those as well. So I'm just happy to see what comes out of this and to connect with people.
Cool. Well, thanks so much. And maybe I'll put your contact info or something.
Yeah,
That
of
would be
course.
cool.
Yeah.
Nice. And I'll